The Gathering Storm, 1848 to 1860. After studying of this unit, the American history student should be able to answer the following questions. Why did Americans move west of the Mississippi River during the 1830s and 1840s? How did they accomplish this, and where did they move to? How did Texas become part of the United States? Why was the process so complicated, and how did it impact national politics? What were the similarities and differences in how California and Texas were settled, how they became part of the United States, and finally, how did opposition to the Mexican-American War complicate national politics? The addition of the Mexican territory after the Mexican-American War reopened the slavery issue. The Missouri Compromise had only extended the slavery line through the Louisiana Territory. Now, vast quantities of land had been added to the United States, and there existed no provision to delineate slave from free territory. There would be a debate between Northerners and Southerners as Congress became divided over sectional lines, and this is where the Wilmot Proviso comes in. The amendment offered by Pennsylvania Democrat David Wilmot in 1846, which stipulated as an express and fundamental condition to the acquisition of any territory from the Republic of Mexico, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of said territory. End quote. He called for outlawing of slavery in any territories acquired from Mexico. The Wilmot Proviso proposed that free labor should exist in the territory gained in the Mexican War. Wilmot Proviso was never passed. The idea of popular sovereignty, as the debate developed, the question on whether to allow settlers of the territory to decide rose to the fore. Lewis Cass, a Democrat, former senator, and then territorial governor of Michigan, proposed that was known as popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty meant that the voters in a territory had the right to decide whether the territory would be a slave or free territory. Cass believed popular sovereignty would help remove the explosive issue from national politics and appeal to people on both sides of the issue. Congress ultimately did choose to adopt popular sovereignty. Although a solution with seemingly democratic aspects, popular sovereignty in practice meant that the white citizens of a territory had the power to vote on the fate of African Americans. The election of 1848. The Democratic Party. To diffuse the slavery issue, Democratic presidential nominee Lewis Cass proposed the doctrine of popular sovereignty that let the people decide whether the slavery would be permitted or not. Critics of Cass noted that his name rhymed with jackass. For the Whig Party, three men vied for the nomination: Henry Clay, General Zachary Taylor, General Winfield Scott. Slaveholding Zachary Taylor, the hero of Buena Vista, was nominated for president, and although opposed by anti-slavery delegates from Ohio and New England, Millard Fillmore, a New York lawyer with little education, was nominated for vice president. Whigs emphasized Taylor's military character and the reputation, but rejected an Ohio resolution affirming Congress's power to control slavery in the territories. The Free Soil Party. Northern Whigs bolted the party and formed the Free Soil Party, with a platform of free soil, free speech, free labor, free men. The Free Soil Coalition included Northern Democrats, anti-slavery Whigs, and members of the Liberty Party. Created in 1840, the Liberty Party was a third party and had no electoral success at the national level. But those voters impacted elections. They nominated Martin Van Buren for president and nominated Charles Francis Adams, Massachusetts, for vice president. This faction was supported by Charles Sumner and Samuel P. Chase. Their platform held up the Wilmot Proviso. Slavery in the territories became more of an issue following the discovery of gold in California in 1848. Soon the territory of California had enough people to petition Congress for admittance to the Union as a state, but slavery issue had yet to be resolved. The results? Taylor won the election. Taylor won with 1,360,101 votes to Cass's 1,222,544 votes to Van Buren's 291,263 electoral votes. Taylor's 163 electoral votes, 8 slave, 7 free states that he won, and Cass's 127 electoral votes. Van Buren had no state, but split the Democratic vote in New York to Cass, depriving Cass of its 36 electoral votes. However, Zachary Taylor's strong base electoral support was in the South and allowed him to win the presidential election. The California Gold Rush, Sutter's Mill. 7,000 Americans lived in California in 1848, and gold was discovered in January 1848 at Johann Augustus Sutter's Mill on a branch of the American River. News of the discovery soon spread and stimulated a great California gold rush. By the end of 1849, California's population had swollen by 100,000, hence the name 49ers. Mining life. Miners in California were largely single young men from a variety of racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds. Most came to California to strike it rich and return to their homes and former lives with a fortune. Few, however, were successful. Many miners followed rumors of new strikes, leading to tumultuous migratory lives. Placer mining was mines that used cheap metal pans, picks, and shovels to harvest gold flecks from the river and streams. But there was a great deal of violence. Miners in general were prone to suffering from disease and lived in violent, lawless towns. Within 6 months of arriving in California in 1849, one gold seeker in every 5 was dead. General store owners succeeded selling to miners. Hydraulic mining and hard rock mining would replace placer mining. But there was discrimination in the mining communities. About 20,000 Chinese moved to California to pursue mining, but many faced discrimination. Indians were killed and their land taken. Mexicans were driven off and their titles to the land were ignored by the courts. California statehood. San Francisco was transformed from a small port to a bustling metropolis. When California requested admittance to the Union, New Mexico was also ready to enter, and both had forbidden slavery within their borders, even though they fell below the Missouri Compromise line. President Taylor pushed to have them added regardless of their slave status. California and New Mexico. President Polk failed to secure territorial organization for California and New Mexico because the issue of the status of slavery in the newly acquired territories. But the influx of settlers into California after the discovery of gold made the issue of territorial organization a pressing need. When Taylor assumed the presidency, he favored territories determining the question of slavery, not Congress, and informed the people of California and New Mexico not to wait for Congress to act on the issue before forming a government. A convention in Monterey, California, September through October 1849, adopted a constitution banning slavery, ratified by Californians in November. Taylor recommended admitting California immediately, threatening to maintain the Union against recent threats of disunion by Southerners, who immediately attacked his plan. In March 1850, California applied for statehood as the 31st state, which would upset the balance of free and slave states of 15 apiece. Clay, who had played a role in the Missouri Compromise, returned to the Senate just in time to use his skills to prevent the Union from tearing itself apart in 1850. Clay tried to package all the concerns of the free and slave states into 8 resolutions, hoping to settle the issues between the two factions. They were: first, California would become a free state. Second, New Mexico and Utah would become territories without slaves. Third, Texas's claim of land in New Mexico would not be recognized. 4. The federal government would compensate Texas by paying its pre-annexation debts. 5. Slavery would continue in Washington, D.C. 6. The trading of slaves in Washington, D.C. would be prohibited. 7. An enforceable Fugitive Slave Act would be adopted. And 8. Congress would not be allowed to interfere with interstate slave trading. Then came the Great Debate. The Senate debates on these resolutions, the greatest in congressional history, marked the last meeting of the great triumvirate of Calhoun, Clay, and Webster. Clay appealed for mutual concessions and warned that secession was no remedy for Southern grievances. Too ill to speak, Calhoun's speech, read by Senator James M. Mason of Virginia, contained ways the Union could be saved: give the South equal rights in the acquired territories, halt agitation over the slavery question, and amend the Constitution to restore the substantive power of the South enjoyed before the balance of power was destroyed by the government. In essence, give each section veto power over congressional laws, his doctrine of concurrent majority. If the North was unwilling to grant this equilibrium, said Calhoun, let the states we both represent agree to separate in peace. And if the North refuses, we shall know what to do when reduce the question to submission all resistance. Daniel Webster's speech on March 7, 1850, speaking as an American in favor of the Union, not as a sectionalist, said, I wish to speak today, not as a Massachusetts man, nor as a Northern man, but as an American, and a member of the Senate of the United States. Webster supported the resolution holding that slavery was excluded in the territories by virtue of soil and climate, and therefore it was not necessary for Congress to ban slavery in the territories. He urged a compromise and warned his Southern colleagues that a peaceful disunion was impossible. A political end became visible when President Taylor died and Millard Fillmore became president. Fillmore was willing to concede on issues that Taylor had not. Stephen A. Douglas, a young senator from Illinois and rising Democrat known as the Little Giant, found a way to make Clay's compromise work. He broke it into separate proposals and asked Congress to vote on each as its own piece, which allowed moderates or extremists who favored parts of the compromise, but opposed others to vote in favor of the preferred pieces of legislation. John C. Calhoun's death also alleviated some of the pressure on Democrats and Southerners not to support the proposals. In the end, only 5 senators voted for all parts of the so-called Compromise of 1850. But each part passed both the House and the Senate and became law. The final components of the Compromise of 1850 included the following. California entered the Union as a free state. The Texas-New Mexico Act made New Mexico a separate territory and set the Texas state boundary at its present location. In return for giving up its claim to as much of New Mexico, Texas received $10 million, which secured payment of the state's debt. New Mexico can decide for itself the issue of slavery. The Utah Act set up the Utah Territory and gave the territorial legislature authority over all rights subject to legislation, including slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act required the federal government and northern states to help capture and return runaway slaves to the South. Part of a dramatic reversal of previous laws, which granted their freedom once arriving on free land. As a gesture to anti-slavery groups, the public sale of slaves, but not slavery itself, was abolished in the District of Columbia. President Fillmore supported the Compromise of 1850 and helped sustain the Union through the crisis. So, quick review: the Compromise of 1850. California as a free state. Popular sovereignty in Utah and Mexico. They would decide on whether to have slavery or not. Ended the slave trade in the District of Columbia, and a stricter fugitive slave law. Responses to the Fugitive Slave Act. As we see here, this 1851 notice warned free blacks about police and others who could easily kidnap and sell them back into slavery under the new Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act became the most controversial part of the Compromise of 1850 and threatened to tear the nation apart. It required the federal government and Northerners to return runaway slaves. Abolitionists condemned this portion of the Compromise of 1850 as immoral and urged Americans to break or ignore the law. Many moderate abolitionists became passionately opposed to the Fugitive Slave Act, especially when President Fillmore authorized the use of federal troops to enforce it. Reaction against the Fugitive Slave Act was strongest among free African Americans in the North, who responded to the Fugitive Slave Act by forming associations for protection and resistance. The League of Freedom and the Liberty Association were created to stop slaves from being captured. Frederick Douglass convinced the National Black Convention in 1853 to establish a national council, but unfortunately it failed. Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe in response to the Fugitive Slave Act. Uncle Tom's Cabin detailed the life of a fictional slave in the South and the struggles of a slave family. It became a bestseller and helped bring to light the plight of the slaves in a society that did its best to ignore it. Stowe's novel ignited a firestorm over slavery, moving many Northern whites to more active anti-slavery participation. Southerners condemned Uncle Tom's Cabin. By the time of the Civil War, it had sold more copies than any work of an American fiction ever. Northern blacks embraced the work as beneficial to aiding the plight of blacks. It emphasized Christian values as being opposed to the institution of slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin succeeded because it presented real characters and not just abstract arguments. Although her book was influential, especially in the North, it was filled with many contemporary myths about blacks, saying that blacks were inferior, even free blacks. The most intelligent blacks were mulattoes. Her solution to the free black problem was Journey Back to Africa. The election of 1852. Whigs met in Baltimore. The Compromise of 1850 had divided the Whigs. No statesmanlike candidate of national recognition was chosen because, like Daniel Webster, were tainted with Northern Whigs for strongly supporting the fugitive slave law. Although President Fillmore had signed the Compromise of 1850, the Whigs failed to capitalize on their role in the compromise. The Whigs turned for a third time to a military hero on the 53rd ballot, Winfield Scott, hero of Veracruz, old fuss and feathers, and for vice president, William H. Graham from North Carolina. The Whig platform was less enthusiastic about the compromise, hoping to soft pedal the issue of slavery nationally, condemn further agitation of the slavery issue, affirmed states' rights, and supported river and harbor improvements. Democrats' leading candidates were Stephen A. Douglas, Lewis Cass, William L. Marcy, and James Buchanan, but the two-thirds rule kept any of them from being nominated. For the second time, a dark horse candidate was chosen after 48 ballots. A lawyer, Senator Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire, veteran of the Mexican War, and an alcoholic who favored slavery. Nominated for vice president was William R. King from Alabama. Democratic platforms strongly supported the finality of the Compromise of 1850, including its man-stealing fugitive slave law, affirmed opposition to attempts to renew agitation in Congress over the slavery issue, and endorsed the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. The Free Soil Party in Pittsburgh had John P. Hale in New Hampshire and George W. Gillian of Indiana were nominated on a platform that condemned slavery in the Compromise of 1850 and supported free homesteads for landless settlers of impeded entry for immigrants. During the campaign, the two major parties, hoping to keep the slavery issue out of the campaign, centered on the personalities instead. Democrats' slogan, "We pulped them in 44, we'll pierce them in 52. Critics of Pierce called him the hero of many a bottle. Whigs also badly split between a northern wing that supported the candidates but not the platform that endorsed the fugitive slave law, and a southern wing that supported the platform but were not enthusiastic about Scott, who was an inept campaigner. The results? thousands of Southern Whigs voted Democrat. 5,000 Democrats in Georgia voted for Webster, although he had died 2 weeks before the election. Pierce received 254 electoral votes, 27 states, to Scott's 42 electoral votes in 4 states. The election effectively signaled the end of the Whigs as a national party and indicated the decline of Free Soilers, whose candidate received less votes in 1852 than in 1848. The Kansas-Nebraska Crisis. With opening of markets in Asia, a quicker method of shipping goods from coast to coast was needed. As a result, Congress considered several proposals for a transcontinental railroad. Stephen A. Douglas, the Little Giant, promoted a path to the west with Chicago, located in his home state of Illinois, as the point of departure. His plan, which cut through the Louisiana Territory, provided an incentive to the South, and that the Missouri Compromise would be amended in that area, allowing each territory to choose whether to hold slaves by popular sovereignty. President Pierce forced the Native Americans to cede land for the railroad in 1853. Douglas sought congressional approval to set up a government in the Nebraska territories. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in 1854. The bill broke the territory into 2 territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Douglas supported popular sovereignty. The law passed in 1854, creating the Kansas and Nebraska territories, but leaving the question of slavery open to residents, therefore repealing the Missouri Compromise. Northerners of all parties were outraged by the Kansas-Nebraska Act because the bill repealed the Missouri Compromise and showed the South's determination to spread slavery. They were also convinced that a slave power conspiracy was in control of the federal government. Douglas was criticized, and motives were attributed to him for suggesting that he courted Southern Democrats for a run at president. President Pierce supported the Kansas-Nebraska bill, which became law. However, he failed to effectively handle the territory and the problems of Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act map, and as we can now see that there's 2 new territories of the Nebraska Territory and the Kansas Territory. The area inset into this box right here, which we see below, is going to be the result of the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is going to be known as Bleeding Kansas. The emergence of the Republican Party. With the demise of Free Soilers and Whigs, political forces realigned in the West and the North. A coalition of Whigs, Free Soilers, and anti-slave Democrats met in Ripon, Wisconsin in February 1854 to discuss the organization of a new party on the single principle of opposition to extending slavery into the territories. The name Republican was officially adopted in July at Jackson, Mississippi, with a platform that called for the repeal of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Fugitive Slave Law, and demanded the removal of slavery from the District of Columbia. Early leaders were individuals such as Charles Sumner, George Julian, former Free Soilers Salmon P. Chase, and Lyman Trumbull, and conservative Whigs Edward Bates and Oliver H. Browning. Abraham Lincoln's Peoria speech, his first public denunciation of slavery, he condemned the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but did not believe it resulted from a slaveholder conspiracy. Lincoln acknowledged the constitutional rights of Southerners, a preference for gradual emancipation, and a fair, practical fugitive slave law, but opposed slavery in the territories. Bleeding Kansas. Popular sovereignty was severely tested when Kansas was open to settlement because of non-intervention was now Congress's policy. Whoever controlled the territory government was vitally necessity which provoked armed conflicts between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. Northerners financed immigration to Kansas by many who favored no slavery. Southerners also sent pro-slavery supporters, especially from neighboring Missouri, a slave state. Border ruffians. In the Kansas Territory, both pro and anti slavery forces were poured into the country. Pro slavery elements in the Kansas manipulated the status of the Kansas-Nebraska Act by arming border ruffians from Missouri who came in on election day to support slavery. Beecher's Bibles was the name given to a New England immigrant aid company that brought in Beecher's Bibles. They were actually cases marked Bibles, but inside there were guns. A gift from Henry Ward Beecher, a New York preacher and brother to the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe. The Topeka was a pro-slavery voters, a majority of them fraudulent, elected a pro-slavery legislature. Anti-slavery forces met in Topeka and formed a government outlawing slavery and petitioned the Congress for statehood. President Pierce denounced the measure and threw his support behind the pro-slavery government. The result of this was Bleeding Kansas. Sporadic violence erupted, leading journalists to call the conflict Bleeding Kansas. And it broke out in 1856, starting with a band of pro-slavery forces that sacked Lawrence, but no one was killed. In response, John Brown and 4 of his sons, armed with broadswords, hacked to death 5 pro-slavery settlers in Potawatomi Creek. Senate bloodshed. Charles Sumner, senator from Massachusetts, in the congressional debates over Kansas in May 1856, Sumner bitterly denounced the slave oligarchy and its rape and referred to Senator Andrew P. Butler of South Carolina, a Democrat, as a Don Quixote who has chosen as his mistress the harlot of slavery, who was absent. South Carolinian Congressman Preston Brooks, kin of Senator Butler, took the verbal attack personally and beat Sumner unconscious with his walking cane as he sat at his desk in the Senate chamber. Sumner collapsed under the heavy blows. Sympathetic senators sent Brooks with 300 new canes to be applied in a similar fashion. Sumner did not again attend congressional sessions, except for a single day until December 1859. In the North, the Brooks-Sumner affair was condemned as a gross violation of free speech. Massachusetts left the Senate seat vacant as a silent testimony to the debasing effect of slavery. Attempts to expel or censure Brooks in the House failed. Although his action was generally approved in the South, Brooks had resigned. In the midterm elections of 1854, with all the issues garnering national attention, the midterm elections had its share of political issues that showed that the nation was increasingly divided over long sectional lines. Brooks was unanimously re-elected to his seat. The Know-Nothings, the American Party. Mounting violence polarized the North and the South and widened sectional conflicts within the political parties. Between 1854 and 1856, Northerners moved into new political parties that changed the national political scene and intensified the sectional conflict. Nativists were anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic sentiment gave rise to what is known as the Know-Nothings. The anti-immigrant feeling also contributed to the party realignment. The Democrats tried to appeal to the Irish immigrants, but nativists formed the anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic Know-Nothing Party. Anti-immigrant party was formed of the wreckage of the Whig Party and some disaffected Northern Democrats in 1854. I know nothing was the strategy to answer any issue with I know nothing. It didn't work. The election of 1856. Republicans
A Republican coalition in Philadelphia nominated Colonel John C. Fremont of California for president and William L. Dayton of New Jersey for vice president. Democrats in Cincinnati nominated James Buchanan of Pennsylvania on the 17th ballot for president, after rejecting Pierce and Douglas because of their association with the Kansas, and John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky for vice president. The Know-Nothings of the American Party in Philadelphia nominated Millard Fillmore of New York for president and Andrew J. Donaldson for vice president on a nativist platform, both of whom were endorsed in Baltimore by Whigs, who warned against sectionalizing of political parties. During the campaign, Democrats affirmed the Compromise of 1850 and supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act as the only safe solution of the slavery issue. Republicans upheld Congress's authority to control slavery in the territories, condemned the Ostend Manifesto, and favored a transcontinental railroad, the admission of Kansas as a free state, and a Homestead Act using the slogan "Free Speech, Free Soil, and Fremont." It was also pointed out that Fremont was a Catholic, and he was accused of being illegitimate, charges designed to keep Northern Know-Nothings from voting for him. The chief issue was Bleeding Kansas, as Republicans called it, while the Democrats and Fillmore supporters attacked Black Republicans as a sectional threat to the Union. Buchanan received 1,838,169 popular votes to Fremont's 1,335,264 to Fillmore's 874,534, making him a minority president. Buchanan carried 14 slave and 5 free states and 174 electoral votes. Fremont carried 11 free states, 114 electoral votes, while Fillmore only carried Maryland and 8 votes. The election foreshadows the hardening of sectional lines, as there were no men of national stature like Daniel Webster and Henry Clay, both of whom died in 1852, to produce yet another delaying compromise between the sections. The Panic of 1857. In Britain, the Palmerston government circumvented the requirements of the Peel Banking Act of 1844, which required gold and silver reserves to back up the amount of money in circulation. This circumvention set off a panic in Britain, and after the failure of the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company, the financial panic quickly spread as businesses began to fail. The railroad industry experienced financial declines, and hundreds of workers were laid off. Since the years immediately preceding the Panic of 1857 were prosperous, many banks, merchants, and farmers had seized the opportunity to take risk with their investments. And as soon as the market prices began to fall, they quickly began to experience the effects of the financial panic. The banking crisis that caused a credit crunch in the North, it was far less severe in the South, where high cotton prices spurred a quick recovery. Buchanan refused to allow government intervention in the economic problems of the Panic of 1857, angering South Carolina Senator James Henry Hammond and other Southern planters. While the Republicans claimed legislation they sponsored could have prevented the Panic of 1857 favored the Republicans in the 1858 congressional elections. The Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was born in Virginia, a household slave of Dr. John Emerson, an Army surgeon who was taken in 1834 from St. Louis, Missouri, to Rock Island, Illinois, where slavery had been banned by the Ordinance of 1787, and later to Fort Snelling in Wisconsin Territory, where slavery had been prohibited by the 1820 Missouri Compromise. Scott remained on free soil during most of the 1834-1838 years. When Dr. Emerson died in 1843, his wife, Eliza Irene Sanford, remarried an abolitionist from Massachusetts and moved to New England, leaving her business affairs in the hands of her brother, John F. A. Sanford. Rather than free his wife's slaves, the abolitionists encouraged Scott to sue for his freedom to provide a Supreme Court test case, which might deal a blow to the institution of slavery. Scott and his wife Harriet sued for their freedom in the Missouri courts in 1846, holding the position that he had become free after living 5 years in free territory. A lower court ruled in favor of Scott, but in 1852, the state Supreme Court ruled against him in Scott v. Emerson, although in a previous ruling, the same court had ruled that a slave became free after having lived in free territory upon his return to Missouri. This was Rachel v. Walker in 1837, based on the principle, once free, always free. In the case of Dred Scott v. Sanford, unfortunately, Scott's lawyers injected other issues into the case rather than just freedom, like Scott's ability to sue in a federal court and the issue of blacks' claim to be a U.S. citizen. The issue shifted to whether Scott had ever been free, not whether Missouri could keep him in slavery. It also challenged the constitutionality of the Missouri Compromise and the power of the Congress to limit slavery in the territories. The Supreme Court ruled against Scott 7-2 on March 6, 1857. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney dismissed Scott's case, and his opinion argued African Americans in the northern states were not citizens and so could not initiate a lawsuit. He also ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court ruled against Scott, saying that slaves have no rights, and declared that any law that said otherwise was illegal. The majority of the justices themselves owned slaves. By declaring the Missouri Compromise prohibition of slavery illegal, the Supreme Court justices declared an act of Congress unconstitutional for the first time since Marbury v. Madison had established judicial review in 1803. According to this ruling, slavery could not be limited by Congress or territorial governments, which threatened to extend slavery in all parts of the United States. This threatened one of the major goals of the Republican Party, limiting slavery's growth. Response to the Dred Scott case, free blacks of the North organized and protested the decision. The Republican Party gained more electoral support in northern states. It further divided the Democrats because Southerners celebrated the decision as a huge victory for pro-slavery forces. With the court's intrusion on the slave issue, many felt the compromise of slavery was now impossible, moving the nation irretrievably towards war. The Lecompton Constitution. Violence had subsided in Kansas. Kansas would draft a constitution that allowed for slavery, but again, due to fraud, free state voters boycotted the referendum. Eventually, it was passed. Territorial Governor Robert Walker showed integrity when he uncovered and revealed election corruption in Kansas. Although a strong defender of slavery, he opposed the blatant injustice of the Constitution and resigned rather than implement it. This new Constitution enshrined slavery in the proposed state and protected the rights of slaveholders. In addition, the Constitution provided for a referendum that allowed voters the choice of allowing more slaves to enter the territory. Constitution with slavery versus Constitution with no slavery. But the Constitution with slavery clause would not have made Kansas a free state. It merely would have banned future importation of slaves into Kansas, something deemed to be many as unenforceable. Boycotted by free soilers, the referendum suffered from serious voting irregularities, with over half the 6,000 votes deemed fraudulent. Topeka and Lecompton constitutions. Nonetheless, both the Lecompton and Topeka constitutions were both sent to Washington for approval by Congress. Buchanan, desiring party unity, submitted the Lecompton Constitution to Congress in February of 1858, recommending that Kansas be admitted as a slave state, which ruptured the Democrats because Douglas had come out against the Lecompton Constitution as a violation of popular sovereignty and a mockery of justice. Douglas and his supporters were punished by the Democratic hierarchy in Congress, and the Senate voted to admit Kansas under the Lecompton Constitution. The House, however, resubmitted the Constitution to the people of Kansas for a popular vote. The results: the Constitution was rejected in August of 1858, 11,208 votes against, only 1,926 for. This gave Republicans a powerful campaign issue and encouraged the rise of Southern extremists over moderates. Kansas statehood would be delayed until January of 1861, when it was admitted as a free state under the Lecompton Constitution. Lincoln-Douglas debates. The Lincoln-Douglas debates pitted the incumbent Democrat Senator Stephen A. Douglas against former Whig Congressman Abraham Lincoln. At first, Douglas refused to debate Lincoln, but Lincoln would follow Douglas and heckle him until he agreed to the debate. Lincoln was a popular politician in Illinois due to his down-to-home humor, his quick wit, his charismatic speaking style, and his firm stand that slavery should not spread to the territories. Lincoln gave his House divided speech in Springfield when accepting the nomination for senator on June 16, 1858, when he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free." The series of debates in 1858 Illinois senatorial campaign, during which Douglas and Lincoln staked out differing opinions on the issue of slavery in the territories. The debates were held throughout Illinois and highlighted the differences between the Democrats and Republicans, and North and South. Then came the Freeport Doctrine. This was the most memorable debate, where Douglas formed his Freeport Doctrine. Lincoln asked Douglas how to reconcile popular sovereignty with the Scott decision. Asked Lincoln, "Can the people of a United States territory, in any lawful way, exclude slavery from its limits prior to the formation of a state constitution?" Now, if Douglas answered yes, he would be going against Dred Scott, thereby alienating many voters in Illinois and most voters in the South. If he answered no, he would alienate the other voters in Illinois and most voters in the North. Lincoln basically gave him one of those questions: no matter how he answers, it's going to hurt him. Douglas replied that the people of the territory could exclude slavery by lawful means prior to the formation of a state constitution because, he said, slavery couldn't exist today or an hour anywhere unless supported by local police regulations established by the local legislatures. His answer was not considered strong enough by Northerners and reminded Southerners that certain police powers were required to make slavery work. Southern senators would deprive Douglas a key Senate post and cost him support among Southern Democrats as well. These debates indicated the differences between Lincoln and Douglas. Lincoln regarded slavery as a moral, social, and political wrong, but rejected black equality. Douglas avoided the moral issue. The results: Lincoln won the popular vote in Illinois, but failed to carry the legislature 54-41, which at the time, that's what elected senators, which according to the U.S. Constitution. Douglas won the election, but Lincoln emerged in the national spotlight. By 1860, there were only 18 free states and 15 slave states in the United States, which caused the pro-slavery forces to feel increasingly marginalized in national politics. Across the nation, many began to believe that slavery could be ended or defended only with violence. The North was increasingly urban, and the rate of the urban industrial growth in the North was greater than anywhere else in the world in the early 1800s. The South remained rural and agricultural, and more people employed in agriculture. More violent tendencies among Southerners, a stronger inclination to serve in the military, and stronger evangelical support for slavery, and a higher illiteracy rate. John Brown's raid. John Brown had become a celebrity in New England and intellectual and anti-slavery circles for his anti-slavery efforts in Kansas. Brown was a native of Connecticut, and in 1859, Brown created a small army and attacked the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to trigger a slave uprising. Brown first collected arms at the Kennedy Farm in Maryland before crossing the Potomac, leading 18 men, including 5 slaves, to Harper's Ferry, Virginia. There they seized the federal arsenal and armory. They took some local citizens hostage and issued a call throughout the countryside for other slaves to join the rebellion. The first man that was killed, ironically, was a free black postal carrier. When no slaves answered the call to rebel after 2 days of battle, Brown and his survivors were taken prisoners by the U.S. Marines under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee. A treason trial would ensue from October 25th to December 2nd. Brown was indicted for treason against Virginia and criminal conspiracy to incite a slave insurrection, and was tried at Charlestown, Virginia, convicted, and hanged along with 4 of his band on the 16th, and 2 others on 16 March 1860. The effects: Southerners blamed abolitionists and black Republicans for Brown's raid. Conservative Northerners deplored the raid. Abolitionists mourned Brown as a hero and martyr, and Southerners saw it as an example of what the North would do if given a chance. John Brown's raid raised the worst fears of Southerners. The state militias began to seriously now train in preparation for a future type of raids by abolitionists. The election of 1860. Democrats first met in Charleston, where they were divided. Southern Democrats favored William L. Yancey's platform to protect slavery in the territories. The non-Southern delegates supported Stephen A. Douglas for president, in a plan that pledged obedience to the Dred Scott decision. Douglas should have been the logical choice. However, he had turned off many Southerners with his Freeport doctrine, which suggested a legal way of evading the Dred Scott decision. His opposition to Kansas being admitted as a slave state on the Lecompton Constitution. So they're going to try to meet again in Baltimore. But however, with the split in the party, Northern Democrats would nominate Douglas, while Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. The Republicans became the clear favorite in the presidential election of 1860 due to the Democratic split. Republicans chose a moderate with Abraham Lincoln and earned the Republican nomination for president by upsetting William Seward. The Constitutional Union Party, where Whigs from the Upper South nominated John Bell of Tennessee. It was a national party formed in 1860 mainly by the former Whigs that emphasized allegiance to the Union and strict enforcement of national legislation. A Wide Awakes group of red-shirted, black-caped young men who paraded through the city streets in the North, extolling the virtues of the Republican Party during the 1860 presidential election campaign. Dividing the national map. Reflecting the sectional nature of the campaign, 3 of the 4 candidates in 1860's presidential election tear the fabric of national unity. Lincoln and Douglas yank at the North and West, and Breckinridge pulls at the South, while the 4th candidate, John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party, makes a futile attempt to try to glue the pieces back together. The results. Although many hoped that the multiplicity of candidates would force this election into the House of Representatives, Lincoln won a popular vote of 1,866,352 to Douglas's 1,375,157. Breckinridge received 847,953 votes, and Bell received 589,581 votes, making Lincoln, who did not carry a single Southern vote, that's because he wasn't even on any ballot, a majority. Lincoln carried 180 of the 303 electoral votes, 18 free states as the clear winner, despite Southern states' refusal to place his name on the ballot. Breckinridge came in second with 72 electoral votes, 11 slave states, To Bell's 39, he won 3 border states to Douglas's 12. All he won was Missouri, and he got 3 electoral votes from New Jersey. Had a fusion ticket been formed with Lincoln's opposition, it would have changed the outcome in only 3 states, New Jersey, California, and Oregon, a total of 11 electoral votes, and would not have affected the outcome of the election. The response in the South, where 10 years earlier Robert Barnwell Rhett had failed at the Nashville Convention, he and his supporters were now ready for the desperate alternative of secession by separate state action. The South Carolina legislature, which was still in session since choosing presidential electors, called for a state convention to consider secession. In Charleston on December 20th, 1860, they voted unanimously to leave the Union. A lame duck president, whose Southern-dominated cabinet had left Washington, Buchanan did little more than condemn secession. The nation was uncertain about secession when it came. President Buchanan was conciliatory by nature, had sympathies towards the South. He had a number of prominent Southerners in his cabinet: Howell Cobb, Secretary of Treasury; Jacob Thompson, Secretary of the Interior from Mississippi; and John Floyd from Virginia, Secretary of War. His closest confidants were Senators Jefferson Davis of Mississippi and John Slidell of Louisiana. They would have an influence. In his annual address to Congress, Buchanan declared secession as illegal, but claimed there was nothing the federal government could do about it. Seward ridiculed the president by responding, "No state has the right to secede, unless it wishes to." Buchanan was no Andrew Jackson or Abraham Lincoln, but he feared that if he tried to coerce these states back, it would cause more states to secede. He had given his annual address in early December before South Carolina seceded. His views may have encouraged the 7 states to break and leave the Union, even though it was perhaps inevitable, but it also could be said that his tolerance kept others from joining the first 7. Mississippi, the storm center of secession, would follow on January 9, 1861. Florida would be the 3rd state on January 10th. Alabama, the 4th, on January 11th, and the rest of the states were not as predictable in the vote for secession. There was in the South cooperationists. They advocated, well, let's wait and see what Lincoln administration actually will do about slavery. They called themselves the cooperationists. Those who opposed this action labeled them submissionists. Georgia was critical. Alexander Stephens opposed this government of our fathers with all the defects comes nearer in the objects of a good government than any other on the face of the earth. Unionist Herschel V. Johnson and Benjamin H. Hill supported Stephens, but the most powerful voices would prevail. Senator Robert Toombs and Secretary of Treasury Howell Cobb were concerned about the justice of the South under a Republican administration. Cobb wrote each hour after Lincoln's inaugural that Georgia remains a member of the Union will be an hour of degradation to be followed by speedy and uncertain ruin. On January 19th, Georgia voted 218 to 89 to leave the Union. Louisiana was in even a more difficult spot. They depended on the protected tariff since the majority of them were sugar growers, not cotton. The city of New Orleans had a European population of 40%, so no sympathy to the cause. On January 26, they voted 113 to 17 to secede. In Texas, on February 1st, 1861, Texas would vote 166 to 8 to secede. Despite the objection of Governor Sam Houston, a Jacksonian nationalist and hero of the Texas Revolution, he would be removed from office for his refusal to take an oath for the Confederacy. Texas then submitted the convention's referendum to a popular vote. It passed 3 to 1. Houston tried to warn his fellow Texans. that do not underestimate the North. Although they move very slow, they will move in full force. 7 states have now left the Union. What would be the response of the nation? The Organization of Confederate States of America met on February 4, 1861 in Montgomery, Alabama. 6 states, with Texas coming later, met in Montgomery to form a government. Howell Cobb was the chair of 50 delegates. They drafted a provisional constitution and named their country the Confederate States of America. They elected Jefferson Davis as provisional president and Alexander Stephens as provisional vice president. The delegates rejected the fire eaters and wanted moderates for the new government, who they saw as their George Washington and John Adams. Final efforts of compromise. There were peace proposals. Kentucky Senator John J. Crittenden tried to package a series of constitutional amendments to solve the sectional dispute, but this effort failed. Both houses of Congress appointed committees to study the possibility of compromise. On December 18th, the Crittenden Compromise called for the extension of slavery to the Pacific below the Missouri Compromise line of 36 degrees 30 minutes, to compensate owners of fugitive slaves which were not recovered, and introduce a constitutional amendment which would have preserved slavery as inviolate except by state law. Lincoln sent word that he opposed extending slavery into the territories. As late as December 31st, the Senate committee considered it was still undecided. Lincoln's view on secession. He did not support the compromise measures on secession. Senator Jefferson Davis and Southerners of the committee would accept the compromise if the Republicans would do so. Republicans refused due to the president-elect entertained no proposition for a compromise in regards to the extension of slavery. So the compromise failed. This would play an important role in causing such states as Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas to move to secede. Lincoln counted on Unionist sentiment to keep the Upper South from seceding. There were other peace proposals. Among them was one stating that Congress by law would never interfere with slavery in any state, or could a further amendment be passed which could interfere with slavery. The House quickly passed this amendment amazingly by a 2-to-1 margin, and the Senate passed it 24-12 on March 4th. And then it was sent to the states. Ohio quickly passed it. It would have been the 13th Amendment. Even Lincoln and many Republicans favored it if it kept the Union intact. But petitions were submitted to Congress from Boston and New York on 12 February, which called for the passage of the Crittenden Compromise. Charles Francis Adams, son of John Quincy Adams, grandson of John Adams, worked to have New Mexico admitted as a slave state if the citizens so choose. Wisconsin and other northern states quickly repealed personal liberty laws favoring fugitive slaves. In Boston, a mob prevented a memorial service for John Brown. All efforts failed to bring any state back to the Union. This might have been due to there was no Henry Clay. There was no Daniel Webster that could possibly make this happen. Southerners see this as the Northerners don't want to fight it. Lincoln's inauguration. President Lincoln's strategy regarding secession focused on keeping the states of the Upper South in the Union. Lincoln firmly, in a conciliatory manner, assured the rights of the South would be protected, stating, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the state where it exists." But Lincoln would not allow secession, declaring that no state, upon its own mere action, can lawfully get out of the Union. The Union was perpetual, and as the president, he would execute the laws of the Union in all states and would hold, occupy, and possess any federal property in any state. Violence could be avoided unless it be forced upon the national authority. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not to mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government. Why, I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Through passion may have strained it, must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will, by the better angels of our nature. In one way, when you look at what Lincoln was saying, that the issue of civil war is in your hands, he's setting up the South and ready to pick a fight, but make it look like it's the South's fault, similar to what he accused Polk of doing. End of the waiting game. The issues of federal properties in the Confederate States of America. One of the most sensitive issues forcing Buchanan and the new Confederate government was the possession of federal properties, military posts, federal arsenals, custom houses, and post offices. Most federal properties surrendered due to the fact that they were under the direction or command of Southerners. However, two military forts refused to surrender. Fort Pickens in Pensacola, under the command of Lieutenant Adam J. Slimmer, and Fort Sumter in Charleston, under the command of Major Robert Anderson. Fort Sumter. Major Robert Anderson moved his garrison from Fort Moultrie to Fort Sumter. Anderson was bombed by honor, a recurring theme of the war, and would not give up the fort. Buchanan refused to do so as well. Buchanan ordered Fort Sumter to reinforce and also be resupplied. But the unarmed ship, the Star of the West, that went to resupply the fort, was repulsed by shore batteries in South Carolina and forced to turn back to New York. Buchanan vowed to protect public property as far as existing laws were practical. Buchanan did not see this as an act of war. Warning, Will Robinson. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas all warned that they opposed any attempts of the federal government to coerce a state to re-enter the Union by force. They said that if they do so, that they would probably more than likely secede from the Union as well. Now, what is interesting and what was not brought to you is these four states did have votes to secede. They all said no. But here is the warning. Don't try to force the hand. The die is cast. Lincoln decided on April 6 to provision the garrison at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor and notify South Carolina and the Confederate government in Montgomery that an expedition was being sent directly to resupply the post with no troops, no arms, no ammunition. Lincoln's original orders were to have the supply ships to be escorted by warships, but the Powhatan sailed for Pensacola instead. The Confederacy will end up firing the first shots at Sumter when Jefferson Davis discovered that Lincoln had ordered the food to be sent to the fort. Crossing the Rubicon. Since February 15th, the Confederate Congress resolved to possess both Fort Sumter and Fort Pickens at Pensacola. Now Davis assembled his cabinet on April 9th to discuss the matter. All agreed except Toombs that the fort needed to be taken. Toombs said, "It is suicide. It is murder, and we will lose us every friend of the North. You will wantonly strike a hornet's nest, which extends from the mountains to the ocean in legions. Now quiet, will swarm out to sting us to death. It is unnecessary and puts us in the wrong. It is fatal." Toombs pleaded with Davis that Lincoln was baiting him for a fight and not to try to take the bait. A wire was sent to General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard to inform Major Robert Anderson to surrender at once or face withdrawal by force of arms to begin at 4 o'clock in the morning on April 12th. Anderson offered to surrender when his supplies would run out in about 2 days, not knowing that the resupply attempt of South Carolina had rejected it, knowing that the resupply ship was already en route. Firing on Fort Sumter. Anderson offered to surrender when his supplies ran out in about 2 days, not knowing of the resupply attempt. South Carolina rejected it, knowing that the resupply ship was already en route. Edmund Ruffin, the fire eater and now a member of the South Carolina militia, was given the honor of firing on the fort. Shore batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter at 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, beginning the war. Civilians watched with fascination from the rooftops around Charleston Harbor. About 40 hours of intense but bloodless bombardment occurred. Anderson would then hoist the white flag of surrender on 13th of April. South Carolina demanded that Major Anderson surrender the fort at once. The Civil War had begun. A bloodless battle would begin the bloodiest war in American history. So who's to blame? Historians have debated this issue. Was it Lincoln playing a Machiavellian game of picking a fight and making it look like the South's fault? Strangely, the same thing he accused the Polk of doing with the Mexican War. Or was Davis wanting to fight in hopes that the other slave states would secede and join the Confederacy? Davis originally wanted to seize Fort Pickens, and on April 3rd he had wrote Major General Braxton Bragg, and it was feasible to take the fort. Bragg informed Davis that the risk would be too high. Davis would then discard the plan and decides on Sumter. Lincoln told his Illinois friend Oliver H. Browning a few weeks later, the relief plan succeeded. They attacked Sumter. It fell, and thus more service than otherwise could. This really means that Lincoln was looking to pick a fight. The New York Times also put the blame solely on the Confederacy. Hostilities seemed inevitable. Both wanted the fort, and they would have to fight for it. Lincoln could have supplied it indefinitely, according to Rowland, and remained the defender. It was Davis who was at the disadvantage in order to attain his goal and would be seen as the aggressor. Toombs, his Secretary of State, was prophetic. He claimed that an attack on the flag would unleash a hornet's nest of patriotic wrath looking for revenge. As one northern newspaper put it, an audacious and insulting aggression upon the authority of the Republic without the provocation or excuse. And so we see the eve of the nation on the brink of the Civil War. The Confederacy at this time, this is what was the borderline. Those are the states that seceded before Sumter. What we'll soon see in the next unit of study is 4 more states who had warned, don't try to bring the South back into the Union, will then secede from the Union, being Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. For Lincoln, the big event that he's going to have to try to solve is how to keep Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware with the Union. So this ends our unit of study of the tensions in the United States. Next, we'll look at the American Civil War, the War for Union.